Welcome to the recording of our discussion held on February 22nd. If you have not yet watched the original source material, it is on your screen now. You can follow that link to watch the conversation that inspired this reflection. Welcome.
When we are together, we are in holy space. So I am going to put some chalice lighting words in the chat box if you want to read along. They are straight from the Article 2 Commission. Covenant lies at the heart of our faith, a shared agreement on how we should be together. Our religion is made from an ongoing, interlocking, and organically growing series of promises we make with our communities, congregations, and the world. My candle, every time, the wick is like, it likes to go deep. There we go. So, thank you for being here and making time tonight for this conversation. Article 2 Commission. So, yes, I am actually going to share my screen. There's a ton of information on the Article 2 Commission on the UUA website. And that is because the Article 2 Commission is happening right now, and they want people to engage and want people to know about it. So I'm going to share my screen so you can see. This is the UUA website, and if you go here and you just put in the search box Article 2 Commission, you can find all kinds of information about it. But essentially Article 2 is the bylaws of the UUA, Article 2, that's what that's referring to. And the Article 2 of the UUA bylaws articulates our principles and purposes. And so when we talk about our 7 principles, or 8, if it's a congregation that's adopted the 8th principle, and when we talk about our sources, that's the principles as defined in Article 2 of the UUA. And they're listed here. The first part of the list is the 7 principles. The 8th principle is not currently on the UUA website, although they are working very closely with the 8th principle folks in the Article 2 Commission process. And then our sources, so starting here and downward, are the 6 sources of from which we draw for spiritual nourishment. And it says right at the bottom of Article 2, grateful for the religious pluralism which enriches and ennobles our faith, we are inspired to deepen our understanding and expand our vision. As free congregations, we enter into this covenant, promising one another our mutual trust and support. So essentially, it is written, Article 2 of the UUA bylaws is written as a covenant with its member congregations. And this is an interesting thing too that people don't always know, is that the UUA is not a hierarchical body the way that many times in churches they function, where there's, they're sort of from up high. There's kind of a hierarchical structure. Unitarian Universalist congregations have congregational polity, meaning that within our congregational spaces, we hold authority. There isn't someone who can tell us as a congregation what to do. The UUA is a supportive body and a unifying organization, but it is something we belong to. They're not the boss of us. And that's different than the way a lot of religious organizations work. So essentially, if you think of the UUA, it's helpful to think of the UUA as an organization that is an organization of member congregations. And this covenant is our agreed upon common ground, what we're all sort of in agreement that we are together. Hence the resource that we looked at for tonight was about covenanting, and that's because Article 2 is a covenant. It is an agreement that we're living into these principles that we're drawing from these sources. Then there's these other sections which says that the UUA shall devote its resources to and exercise its corporate powers for religious, educational, and humanitarian purposes. The primary purpose of the association is to serve the needs of its member congregations, organize new congregations, extend and strengthen Unitarian Universalist institutions, and implement its principles. Inclusion. Systems of power, privilege, and oppression have traditionally created barriers for persons and groups with particular identities, ages, abilities, and histories. We pledge to replace such barriers with ever-widening circles of solidarity and mutual respect. We strive to be an association of congregations that truly welcomes all persons and commits to structuring congregational and associational life in ways that empower and enhance everyone's participation. And finally, freedom of belief. Nothing herein shall be deemed to infringe upon the individual freedom of belief which is inherent in the Universalist and Unitarian heritages, or to conflict with any statement of purpose, covenant, or bond of union used by any congregation, unless such is used as a creedal test. So that's Article 2. And Article 2, there is a requirement, I'm going to stop sharing now. There is a requirement within the UUA policies, bylaws, that Article 2 be reviewed on a regular interval. So Unitarian Universalism took shape in 1961, I'm pretty sure, know my UU history. That was when it was first, when the UUA first, or when the two religions formally became this other thing, right? It didn't replace Unitarians or Universalists, but Unitarian Universalism became its own thing at that time. And there was an original description of who we were that actually Ariel Aronson Eves in our congregation for Brian and Lauren's edification, she preached this past year and really went into the history of that. If you had seen that sermon, it was really helpful, and shared what the original kind of statement of belief was. And that original statement of belief was very different than the 7 principles and 6 sources that we use now. They changed in the first Article 2 commission, which happened in the 1980s. So early in the 80s, it had been about 20 years, they looked at and started to review. And as was shared in this recording, Bill Sinkford was talking about how there were several motivations for that, but one of the strong driving reasons why they looked at and talked about updating our principles and purposes at that time was because the women's movement was really pushing to change the male-dominated language that was in the original statement. There was also a really strong humanism and world religions movement happening in Unitarian Universalism at that time. And I would argue that that was an equally powerful reason why they reevaluated who we are and changed that language. So you saw a really distinct shift happen. And one of the distinct shifts that happened was separating our principles and our principles from our sources. And that was very much related to the humanism, to the threat of sort of a much stronger rejection of Christianity and the sort of roots of our faith in the 80s. And so you saw people pulling apart, like, okay, here's our religious sources or our spiritual sources, and these are our principles. And it became sort of ethic as separate from theology. Like, we pull from lots of theology, but we're going to put that whole thing over here because it's really about our shared ethics. And that was a big change, and that happened in the 80s. They did another review, another Article 2 commission happened in the 90s, where they looked at our principles and purposes, and they didn't end up proposing any changes, which I think is fascinating that they didn't propose any changes at that time. But now we are again at this place where we're reviewing who we say we are. And again, as compared to many other faith traditions, that's a pretty unique thing, to have a faith tradition that stops and says, hold on, is our language reflecting who we are? And has this willingness to literally redefine ourselves as this organization of member congregations. I think it's awesome that we are that kind of faith tradition, because I think it really reinforces some of the foundations of our theology, which is this idea of revelation not being sealed, of continually learning and growing, changing and evolving. And you have to be willing to acknowledge that our language isn't going to stay accurate as that process is happening. So that's what's happening right now, is that, again, we are at another cycle of examining what these words say. And concurrent with this moment is also a big movement for adding the eighth principle, and other dialogue that's happening in our faith around, yeah, this language really isn't who we are anymore. So we watched a recording of the conversation, and I'm going to share that, and so you can just tag it, that allowed us to think a little bit about what is in there, and listen to some of our faith leaders, some pretty remarkable faith leaders, talk about covenant in the context of this. And I would love to start just by letting Lauren and Brian reflect a little bit, if there were specific things that you heard when you watched that recording that stood out to you, or that you'd like to just kind of lift up before we get into some formal questions. And it's okay if you don't have something that you want to start off with, but I'd love to just hear if you have any thoughts that you'd like to share.
Whatever I just did in the comments, ignore. My notebook was laying on my screen, or my keyboard. I actually have a lot. Well, not a lot, but
what if you could get rid of your kitchen garbage at the
I'm
push
just
of a
opening
button?
this link and it starts playing right away.
oh yeah. I guess one of the things I noticed for myself was getting my brain to go from covenant, which we use at South Church, and I would dare say, being the person out of the three of us who are South Church members who've been here the longest, I feel like when I came to South Church was right around the time we were writing a mission statement, and so that was sort of our first, hey, let's start having a written covenant. I don't know if they had one before that, but within the first 5 years of me being at South Church was when we wrote the mission statement, which we now say at our start within our church services all the time. And then later we started to talk more and more about covenant on all different levels. We started to have small group ministry, which was originally called covenant groups. We started to talk about covenant of right relations. And so, as best I have experienced and know, the idea of covenant at South Church was at least raised up to a higher level. And it's become a really, more of a focus in the past, say, 20 years. And so for me, it was a very local word. It was what we were doing right in the business of our community, which is a perfectly great definition for it. But so what I'd raise up from having watched the discussion with all these UU leaders is the concept of a covenant that's I don't know, it's not just that it's in the among the UU community, the broad UU community with UUs you don't even know, but it just even seemed more than that to me. I'm still getting it into words. And so I think that maybe that is too why I was really taken by this idea. They kept discussing that the covenant is not, the words that make the covenant are not really the covenant itself. It's that they're only an expression of this other thing that we have. And they talked about the importance of being able to express that, but that was just so cool to think of how, so those words need to change because we're going to get we're going to get better and stronger at how to define it and put it into words, and our experiences are going to change the type of words we need to use. I mean, that really helped me bring in more of the whole 8th principle concept and all. So that's probably one of many things I have to say, but I'll stop talking for a few minutes. See if Brian's got anything.
Yeah, I found the whole conversation fascinating. I was fascinated by the dynamics between the 3 different featured panelists, and just the different characters and different perspectives and their different energies. Not to steer it in a negative direction, but there were 2 men and 1 woman, and just the dynamics and the different ways of thinking. And it was just, I won't go any further on that. I just found that was very interesting. I also, the concept of covenant also was something that just struck me. And in a way shorter, way more recent, way more compressed amount of time, I have been experiencing what Lauren described about covenant and that term and how it's used at South Church. And I came at it kind of obliquely and didn't, I just kind of hit the ground running with that because I was not a Unitarian Universalist before I came to Portsmouth. And so I didn't fully understand what that was about, but it made perfect sense as soon as I bumped into it, like, yeah, covenant. Now, I grew up in a Catholic household, so I had a different concept of covenant. And I think that's one of the most interesting things that, in the Catholic concept of covenant is very, more specifically, the Judeo
Christian
sense of covenant. And that's, God's great covenant with Abraham. And I think what we're talking about is something way different in terms of covenant. I think way more truly a covenant as we define it in, maybe it meant something completely different in Aramaic back then. But to me, that sounds like a transaction. Like, I'll give you this, I'll give you some land, I'll give you some, some wealth, I'll give you some things, and you do this for me. And that sounded like a transaction to me. And that never struck me until we've been talking about covenant here. And I think what we're talking about in terms of the covenant, and far be it for me to say, a couple thousand years of religious history, you got it all wrong, but I could say that in many different ways. I think what we're talking about here in terms of covenant is way, way deeper and more relational and more human and more level. It's not, I guess, not hierarchical like Kirsten described. It's like, from up here, I have the power to do whatever I want. And I'll give you these 3 things if you do the thing that I want you to do. And that doesn't sound like a covenant as I've come to know covenant now. So that was not at all spoken or described in this video, but it's something that it elicited in me as I started to follow along there.
Thanks, Brian. I'll share one of the things that stuck out especially for me was Bill Singford. He was talking about the language in our current principles and purposes and how often it speaks to the individual. And he was wondering about what would it look like if we changed that language to be more collective, to be speaking more to community. And that really resonated for me. I'm sure that's not surprising to some of you that would have resonated for me. But also just him pointing that out and then going and looking again at the language and how that's one of those things that, like, you don't even notice it sometimes, the sort of individualized lens in which we sort of swim so often until someone says something and then you go, oh yeah, oh, I can see what you mean. So I really loved that idea, and it feels sort of like, in some ways, an equivalent of widening the circle to the way that, how the feminist movement and the pressure back in the 80s was to change the language away from being male dominated, and now like let's change the language away from being individualized, individual dominated, right, and toward speaking to communities, and speaking to collectives and the power of our collective work rather than the effect of our individual choices, right? And that to me is really, I love that. I think I see that in our faith. I think I see a transition in that direction in our faith. I'm going to pause for a second to welcome Arthur. And Arthur, just to introduce you to Anne Sherpick, who is very new to our community, but joining us for this conversation tonight.
Joining us from sunny California, if you haven't noticed.
It does look sunnier there and lighter.
And happier.
So I will offer two things. Anne, if you'd like to share anything that's popping up for you, please feel free to unmute and do that. I would love to hear if there are thoughts, and you can also say, I'm good. And also just to let you know, Arthur, we were just starting with gut, like first reactions, things that came up when we watched the recording. So you can think if there's something you want to share as well.
Sure. I wish I did have this link and I just overlooked it. And I wish I was delayed 4 hours from Logan flying back east yesterday. So I could have watched this yesterday. Anyway, my only experience with covenant really is through setting a covenant with the students in OWL. And it's pretty amazing. When I was a member in central Pennsylvania, the UUCSB Susquehanna Valley in central Pennsylvania, where I discovered UUism and OWL and a lot of other things. So my experience with covenant really is just through setting that up with the students together. So that's all I'll say.
Awesome. Thanks, Anne. Arthur, how about you? What struck you? I think you're muted, love. Have you started talking?
I am muted, or I was muted, and mostly I was trying to collect my senses here. So I'm gonna do two parts here. The first part is the first principle. I've been having issues with and the same thing with the mission statement, that it is with all people, and I think it needs to be all beings. Or something. I usually stop talking when it gets to with all, and then I just leave it. And the anti-racism, anti-oppression piece of it is really important. And yet, it's really complicated too. So I am not as clear there as to how to go about that. Yeah, that's the big issue there. I don't have clarity within myself about how it's right to go about that. I mean, I think we are making steps towards that. But I mean, within the governance piece, we're making steps towards anti-oppression or anti-patriarchal or whatever, or collaborative governance. But I don't know how to broaden that. So that's the big challenge for us, I think, as a movement and as a congregation.
So am I understanding you right? It's not as much about like what the language would be, but what would it mean if we were being called to that work? Like how to actually do it is what feels complicated, or both?
How to do it? I think internally, internally within different congregations as a movement, it might be complicated.
Mm.
Um, because different congregations are at different places, they have different experiences, they see things differently. I mean, even our congregation is relatively is pretty isolated from the whole UU spectrum. Um, so I don't know how that will play. I think, like many things, I think it will pass. Um,
The eighth principle.
hmm?
The eighth
The eighth
principle.
principle, I think, will pass
Mm.
because in my experience, well, if it's a live GA,
Mm.
I think it will pass. If it's not a live GA, I don't know, because I think in a live GA, what you have is that you go in with this is I think this is where my congregation is, and then you hear a lot of voices that you haven't heard,
Right.
and you tend to become much more inclusive, much more liberal, whatever the word is. But you hear voices that you haven't heard, and you hear how what you've done has hurt them, and it involves a reassessment.
Yeah. I want
I
to
mean,
pause and quantify GA for people that don't know, either in the room or if someone watches this recording later, is General Assembly. So again, the UUA is an organization that serves member congregations, and once a year they have General Assembly where every one of those member congregations can send members to come and engage in workshops and all kinds of things, but it's also where the annual meetings happen. So during GA, there's a series of meetings where they talk about, do we want to change our principles and purposes? Do we, they make all these proposals. And one of the things that that may be coming up this year is adding the eighth principle. I'm not clear on whether that's coming to a vote this spring, at this coming GA, or if it's being integrated into the work of the Article 2 Commission, and whether that, I think if it's being integrated into the work of the Article 2 Commission, it won't be until next year that it all comes up, but it might be coming to a vote. I need to do some homework on that and find out what that plan is. But just to qualify what Arthur was saying, so the last few years, the GA has been virtual, and it's a different feeling when you're in those meetings on your computer than when you would be in this huge room. It felt like a mega church of Unitarian Universalists, and hearing people express their reasoning behind why they were making certain proposals in live time is definitely a powerful and can be a changing experience for folks. Thanks, Arthur. Did I cut you off? Did you want to say more?
no, I was pretty much done. Thanks.
Great. Yeah. So, I had a couple of questions I wanted to ask, and we've started to talk about each of them in our first reactions. So I'm going to swing back and maybe we can add a little bit more. And I think this is where yeah, I don't think it would be wrong to repeat what you've said in the context of these questions. But one was, what's missing from our current covenants or faith language? What isn't named? And yeah, and just to lift up, I really appreciate, Arthur, you longing for that more expansive language that goes behind human-centered, right? So I was lifting up the individualism, then you were going a step further and saying like, no, let's even move away from just being focused on human beings, but really beings and our interconnectedness in this planet and these systems. And that is I couldn't agree more, that us adopting a more expansive lens on our existence in the midst of life on our planet, that feels pretty essential to me, also. And I thank you for naming it, because it's funny how our training, right? Like, it resonated for me to hear them name individualism versus collectivism. And by being distracted by that, I forgot, no, there's even a wider way to look at that. And I agree with that. So other thoughts on that, kind of from that lens, from other folks?
Yeah, I'd like to add, Arthur, that also really struck a chord with me when you said that. And I've been hearing and reading more lately in my own personal pursuits in the current, I guess you could say maybe the current era of the climate movement, as we're now, like, on the brink of disaster, and we're trying to take more deliberate action with respect to that. There's been more discussion about the rights of things that aren't human. And in fact, there have been court cases, and it sounds like maybe some of you are familiar with this just by your reactions to that. There have been court cases around, like, trees having rights and water. That, in fact, the one about water and water having rights, of course, that I think arose out of some indigenous American cultures, and moved to a very high level of the court system, talking about the rights of water. And I think that's something that should be given some very deep consideration vis-a-vis what we're talking about here, and the worth and dignity of who and what are we talking about here, and we should be more expansive about that. And I don't think that's too far of a stretch from where we are, but to build the language around that so that we say it, right now we're talking about the level of the UUA and the bylaws in Article 2 and changing that. But here in our home in South Church, I think we should consider building that language so that we are saying that and owning that all the time on a regular basis, that we are, we stand for protecting everything. And honestly, it's really about protecting us. It's because we're all, and that's one of the principles already, we're all interconnected. And I don't think, maybe we could build more language around that too, because to say we're all interconnected, it's a truth, but it's leaving it pretty surfacial and maybe even feeling a little trite. And I think that we could go deeper and talk about the interconnectedness of natural systems and whole systems thinking, and how humans are a part of that and not outside of that affecting it. So even in environmentalism, we talk about stewardship as if we're outside of nature and we're taking care of it. No, we're part of it. So,
Right.
So thank you, Arthur.
Yeah, and that's an excellent example, that stewardship versus, right. Yeah. Love that. Thank you, both of you. Other thoughts about ways, what's missing from our current covenants or faith language? I love when Lauren's thinking, because she often looks up. It always makes me smile.
Here, I've got to hear myself as well. I can only talk with one ear plug in. This is giving me a lot to think about, and my mind's sort of already going in a slightly different direction than your original question, so I'll try not to go too far off. But I think one of the things that came from the video that we watched, the discussion, was that the commission video on YouTube was that as I mentioned before, they were talking about how the language of the covenant is not the covenant itself. And what I took from that is like, they were saying, we've already got this covenant and all of that. But the language ends up being really important for so many reasons. And I think what I'm gaining right now is, and I've had this experience a lot in the past 5 or 10 years, a lot around the Black Lives Matter movement, is realizing that systemic stuff that's so, already part of me and me, and so one of the reasons I love Unitarian Universalism, one of the reasons I love discussions like this is to help me move away from that. That because the language then also can hinder us, and the language creates that that system and that one way of looking. And so that's just something I'm being reminded of. I kind of feel like, darn it, it's hitting me over the head, and hasn't that happened before? And frustrated that I fell into that hole again, but then appreciating that Brian via Arthur and Kirsten, have reminded me, like, you forgot, Lauren, you've got to remember when you look at those words and what does it really mean, and what do you want it to mean? And I think that's what brings me back to that commission, was that concept of, here you've got the words, and those aren't exactly our covenant, but for a lot of people, they could then hold us back and limit our understanding of the covenant, not of the words, but the words could hinder us from the understanding of what we're really trying to have between ourselves, between each other, in community. I hope that makes sense.
It does. It does, and you're not alone. The repeated, it's wild how often you have to continually exercise the muscle of changing when something's been enculturated, and that's really what it is. It's dismantling cultural lenses, right? Or shifting them, or adjusting them, or embracing new aspects to them. And it's hard because the tracks are already there. It's so easy to slip back into them, and they feel so comfortable you forget that you've done it.
Right. That actually is what I was going to add, is that it's just, I find for a lot of people, it's easier. My husband and I had a joke very early on, being of two different religions. I started Christian and don't align that way anymore, but as a good Presbyterian, he came from Judaism, and he used to talk about feeling that he should just take the path of least resistance, that there was such a pressure on him to, stay with his Judaism and marry a Jewish person, and all that pushback against his family that he ended up doing. And so we've always had a joke of that, but it's just like, it's so real for so many people. And so part of this is that the ease of not challenging this stuff.
Right.
So, but I'm not against the difficulties of it. I just don't want to do it by myself. I'm not good at doing it by myself. So the benefit of community.
Exactly. Right. That's exactly right. Yes. Whew. Yeah, so this question is not unrelated. And so if you still have thoughts about language, feel free to go back to that. But I also wonder, and yeah, it really does feed right into this, is what do we need to do now to pave the way for the future Unitarian Universalism we imagine? And I really love that question, because for me, what's exciting about Unitarian Universalism is what it could be, right? But we're here building the thing of what it could be. And so I would really encourage you to think, like, this to me is sort of a question of what drives you? Like, as a part of this community, like, what is the thing that you wish we were the next time that they're looking at the Article 2 Commission, like that is just totally who we are at that point. That it's framing the conversation the next time we're there. What is it we should be doing now to set the seeds for that? What's your agenda, I guess, is my question. What's at the top of the list there? I'll let everybody think about it and just go ahead and chime in when you feel ready.
I'll state.
Go ahead, Lauren.
I'll state a real quick, simple one because I reviewed some of these questions earlier. And so this doesn't quite get to the question, but it was the first thing that popped in my mind is to not lose the process of revisiting. So you're saying, what do we want for the future? And I want to make sure that we keep doing this. And I feel personally this needs to be stated, even though it seems so obvious, because I feel that I'm seeing things happen outside of our UU, South Church and the greater UUA. I've just been reading articles and everything that I'm experiencing as a teacher, critical race theory, and all these things that are in jeopardy right now, gerrymandering, all of these hot political topics. So often some of the things I'm reading are going into this idea of losing what had been, that these new rules and new laws would lose what we had fought for and would lose things like revisiting and broader decision making. There's some legislation right now in New Hampshire for educational stuff that is just taking away decision making power from educators and putting it off on the side. So every time we move forward, we've got to make sure we don't lose some of the important things that we have. So that's enough of that. Like I said, maybe it's too obvious for UUs, but.
Well, I think that is important though, right? It's what do we already have and how do we make sure we're holding that while also aspiring for what's ahead?
Right. And so we have the need to revisit the covenant every decade or so, which apparently we don't follow to the letter, but I think so. To Lauren's point, from the other side, I married a Jewish woman, and one of the main things I got was, so one of my first experiences meeting her family was to go to a Seder. And now Haggadahs are very different. Haggadah is the text for the Seder. And there are many different ones, and they had their own, which was produced by a coffee company, and I can't remember which one, but I thought it was Maxwell House. And then I read the Maxwell House one, and it was evil. But this one, the key component of that was in every generation, we understand it's a story of progressive liberation. And every generation discovers new things that need liberating or new oppressions and works towards doing that. And that was it for me. It was like, oh yeah. And so Unitarian Universalism was kind of coming from this very multi-religious background that we had, hers, and then I had multiple religions in my background. And it basically was good enough. This is the only one that's not offensive. And and since then it's been more of a growing into that experience. So yeah, I mean, and that experience is continual, but that's what makes it a lived religion as opposed to a sort of doctrinal religion or whatever. Yeah.
Thank you, Arthur. Other thoughts?
Here, could you repeat the question where we started?
Sure.
Because I had a thought and I forgot what it was, and I'm wondering if that might jog it.
Yeah. The question is, what do we need to do now to pave the way for the future Unitarian Universalism we imagine? And I was inviting you to think specifically for yourself, like what's your own agenda of what do you wish for our faith in the future, and what should be in the water now if we want to get there?
Yeah, that sort of does jog where, this wasn't something that I've been carrying with me necessarily ready for this question, but it is something that's been on my mind. And I've wondered what Unitarian Universalism's role could be in this, in the larger community, in the world. And that is, it seems like we're at a moment where authentic engagement, human engagement and discourse is really struggling because we have so many other ways to go besides to sit at a table or whatever, sit together with people and share authentically our own needs and open ourselves to hearing and understanding the needs of others. And so that sort of discourse has been really thinned out. And I think you all know what I'm talking about. One of the first place I'm imagining everybody's minds goes to in this regard is we use social media or other kinds of like, an intermediary between us. Some kind of a tool to communicate, and we're not sitting with each other and giving the sort of deep listening and understanding or offering that. So I think that is in a way inherently part of how we try to be, at least at South Church. I can't say that that's necessarily how it works across Unitarian Universalism, but I can only imagine there's some element of that just based on what Article 2 says about our principles. Okay. Also, the concept of being in covenant, those things are inherently linked and maybe even inextricably linked. To be in covenant, you have to foster that kind of discourse and engagement. So I often ponder what could, Unitarian Universalism and our work at South Church, what we do as a community within ourselves, how can we turn that out? And when we think about the concept of a community of communities, within our own congregations, within Unitarian Universalism, and then expand that out to the greater whole, can the way we think about ourselves going forward and what we can be in the future, can that affect that condition across society? That might be too big. I don't know.
Not too big. I love that. And I love that idea of what you said right at the beginning of what can we offer the wider community, like what is happening here that could be generative toward transformation and growth, right? Mm-hmm. That's great. Thank you, Brian.
Yeah, thanks, Brian. I think that kind of is almost a response to what I started with when I was saying we've got to always be making sure that we're in this discussion, like that I'm feeling that restriction of in society of how we communicate with one another. And so yours is a response, yeah, a response to that, making sure that of how, just not even just with social media, but I think in a lot of ways of having true discussions with one another, because I'm feeling the constriction of that, the restriction of that on a broader view. So I think that's at least in my mind, that's making a segue.
Lauren, I'm going to pause you for a second and let Anne have a chance to
Sure,
to share.
thanks.
Yep.
I am impressed with the wisdom in this room. But so my experience is about the communicating and connecting and conversations and keeping the conversation going. So I'm weaving ironically, I have found technology a saving grace through beloved conversations, through this opportunity to be in California in anticipation of moving. So anyway, I'll just keep that short. That it's an interesting tension between the in-person kind of, because I grew up in person, I'm, versus the next gen, which now I'm addicted to Zoom, to connect, for connection. So it's just that so that's all. It's just sort of, I had some thoughts and I realized this is super complicated and fascinating, the potential as well as the pitfalls of how we connect and move forward. Anyway, that's all, just sort of a reflection on what you're saying, not really adding much, but.
No, that's great. And I do think it's a both and, right? It's like there's ways in which there's enrichment there, and there's also things we can lose. And that almost also comes back to Lauren's comment of like, let's be careful not to lose what's good when we're changing and growing. It's a similar thing with social media, and like how does that help us in transformation and progress, and how do we be careful not to throw away invaluable things about being human beings and being in relationship with each other. Because I couldn't agree more, especially through COVID. It's been very apparent to me that there are connective spaces on this computer. There are also spaces that are exhausting, right? It depends on how you're approaching it. It depends on what you're trying to accomplish. And yeah, all of that. Gosh, that hour went very fast. I could talk for another hour about this. I am just so deeply grateful for everyone's thoughts, and also just energized by, it's neat to talk about this stuff. I think I really firmly believe that, not that Unitarian Universalism is the answer, but that it could be a powerful piece of the work that the world is going to need to be done in the coming 20, 40, 50, 60 years. And that is really exciting to me. And as a parent, it also gives me something to bite into, right? Knowing like our children are growing up into this world, and all of the challenges that are going to get bigger and harder and more complicated. Like, what can we do in this moment to help? So that's what I would add, maybe as a closing thought of what do I want Unitarian Universalism to be, is I want it to be something that can hold my children when they're adults in whatever the world is going to be at that point, right? And I want it to be something that's making the world a better place for the next generations, and more stable and healthier, right? And that there's clean water to drink, and that there's trees and varieties of species of animals and so forth. So I am going to ask us to do a closing together, which is one rooted in hope. And so I would like to give everyone just a minute to think about a word that you would like to put into the air toward hope, toward what could be in our future around that idea of manifesting, maybe. Let's take a minute, and then I'll invite you to unmute and share as you're inspired.
Together.
Say to be expansive.
Open and willing.
Conscious.
Collectivism.
Wonderful.